Desde la Ciudad de México para el mundo, Canal Multimedia Radio. Canal Multimedia, Derecho a tus oídos. Desde la Ciudad de México para el mundo, Canal Multimedia Radio. Canal Multimedia, Derecho a tus oídos. Desde la Ciudad de México para el mundo, Canal Multimedia Radio. Canal Multimedia presenta
Lcda, Programa del Seminario de Filosofía del Derecho de la Facultad de Derecho de la UNAM, conducido por Abril Uscanga Barradas y Alberto J. Montero. Comenzamos.
¿Qué tal? Muy buenas tardes a todas y todos. Estoy muy contenta de estar una vez más aquí con ustedes. Mi nombre es Abril Uscanga y bueno, pues tengo el gran honor, el placer de estar en la conducción de este programa Lcda del Seminario de Filosofía del Derecho. Pues para mí es un placer también estar compartiendo el día de hoy la mesa con Victoria Osornio. Bienvenida, Victoria.
Hola, doctora, muchísimas gracias por dejarme estar aquí.
Ay, encantada, muy bien. Y también con nuestro invitado, el doctor Luis Jiménez. ¿Qué tal, Luis? Muy buenas tardes.
Hola a todos y todas. Estoy muy contento de estar por acá. Muchas gracias por la invitación.
Muchísimas gracias. Y bueno, pues también saludo a quienes se encuentran no solamente siguiendo la transmisión, quienes, bueno, pues esperamos que puedan interactuar también con nosotros a través de las redes sociales, sino también a quien se encuentra en cabina. Muchísimas gracias, Eduardo, por todo el apoyo. Y bueno, pues quiero iniciar también agradeciendo a nuestras autoridades de la Facultad de Derecho por permitirnos realizar este programa. En principio, evidentemente, a nuestro director de la facultad, al doctor Raúl Contreras Bustamante, a nuestra secretaria general, la doctora Sonia Venegas, así como también al encargado de cuerpos colegiados, el doctor Israel Sandoval. Dentro de ese sentido, entonces, quisiera decirles que hoy vamos a tener un programa no solamente muy interesante, sino también muy llamativo, porque vamos a hablar acerca del funcionamiento del sistema judicial americano y todas sus implicaciones, especialmente políticas. Hay muchos temas que están sobre la mesa relacionados con no solamente la estructura, las políticas, sino también las diferencias que hay entre el sistema americano, llamado sistema americano, y nuestro propio sistema. Por lo que el día de hoy pues tenemos a un gran invitado, a alguien que es un gran experto y además que nos va a dar como ese súper background acerca de pues no solamente tal vez un poco de la historia, un poco del funcionamiento de esta corte estadounidense que tanto influencia también a las decisiones de nuestras cortes latinoamericanas y que por alguna razón no solamente pues estratégica, política, sino también pues geográfica, pues para nosotros implica tener un ojo para nuestro vecino del norte y otro ojo hacia nuestro funcionamiento propio. Por ello es que le voy a pedir a Victoria que me ayude a que hagamos este programa un poco más ágil. Vamos a tener un programa básicamente bilingüe, entonces vamos a trabajar en inglés y en español para que todos aquellos que nos siguen, bueno, pues que pueda ser un poco llamativo esto. Por supuesto, pues en ese sentido vamos a hacer ahora un switch, ¿no? Y entonces le voy a dejar el uso de la voz a Victoria para que pueda hacer la presentación de nuestro invitado.
Thank you, doctor. I am very pleased to be here and have the privilege to introduce our guest. We have Luis Jiménez as our guest, who teaches political science at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. His specialties are comparative politics in Latin America and migration. He has been published in multiple specialized magazines in these topics, alongside his last book about the political impact that migrants have when they return to their countries like Mexico, Colombia, and Ecuador. His main subjects of study are very interesting. I am sure we can learn a lot from him. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victoria. It's very nice to have you here, not only Victoria, but also our guest, Luis. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation to be here. It's a privilege, of course, having you. I want to begin asking you about how your Supreme Court of Justice works. Specifically, how do we need to understand not only its function, interest, political interest, structure? How can we understand how it works in general?
So the American Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, is far more powerful than most Supreme Courts in Latin America, because the basic difference is that whenever they make a decision, whenever there's a case, that sets precedent, which means that it supersedes every other case anywhere in the United States. And so because of that, they usually make decisions or make cases that are far fewer than Mexico or any other Latin American court. There's only between 20 and 50 cases, depending on the cases that they take up. The other thing is that, unlike places in Latin America, the Supreme Court is entirely, they can decide on their own what cases to take. That is, they are not forced. They don't have to take up cases if they don't want to. And so part of the reason why that is because the U.S. court system depends on the lower courts, and the lower courts at any level, which is there's district courts and there's federal courts, which can decide on the constitutionality of cases. So usually appellate courts, federal appellate courts, are the ones right below the Supreme Court, and they're the ones that usually, most of the time, decide on the constitutionality of cases, just because the Supreme Court, for the most part, does not or decides very few cases. So that means that every court at every level in the United States has more power than any court in Mexico. Just because any case they can decide the constitutionality, and that can become precedent. So that's a very important distinction.
I imagine that we need to understand how the federal system works in the United States. Can you explain exactly how it works, and if you know that if there is any difference between the U.S. Federal system and the Mexican federal system?
So there are federal courts and state courts. Federal courts are courts that are national courts, but there's three levels, which are district courts at the state level, and then higher courts that are divided in, basically they're appellate courts, and there's different divisions across the United States, but they're sort of above district courts that are state level. So there's basically three levels that are federal courts. And then in addition, there are state courts that just decide on the constitutionality of things related to state law within their state constitutions. So in that sense, they're basically the same as Mexico, but in Mexico, as I understand it, courts cannot decide on constitutionality, or they can decide on constitutionality, but they cannot set precedent. Here they can. Any state, any district court rather, like a judge, for instance, in Texas, can decide the constitutionality of something, and they can set precedent for anywhere, Maine, Hawaii, whatever, as long as they are federal. And then you appeal, and then it goes to the appellate court, and then it goes to the Supreme Court. And then on top of that, there are other specific types of courts related, for instance, to administrative courts or tax courts, and also immigration courts. Immigration courts are a completely separate system that is not part of the judicial system. Actually, they're part of the executive branch, so they work completely different. And there's nothing like it in Mexico, so far as I know. They're completely, and also not within the United States. So this makes for a system that is extremely complicated, extremely complex, and it requires the ability of people to navigate a very complicated system.
Sure. And also to understand the difference between both countries. I want to ask you something because we're not very aware like about presence. We need to understand them better. So I would like to ask you about like how if you can explain a little more about what are presents, like for example, how they are created, how they function, like in the normal process, or for example, how can we integrate? Well, do in the U.S. integrate presence in the American system? Or, for example, if there are any special precedents that you can like tell about some of them that are like pretty important for your system, like to try to understand if we are talking about the same thing.
That's a very good question, and I'm glad you asked that so we can clarify for the audience. So when I say precedent, what that means is when there's a case that gets taken to a court, and as I said, there's 3 levels. So it goes to the first level. That court can decide something, and that becomes precedent. What that means is that it becomes law for every other situation related to that. So let me use the most famous. Well, there's several, but one of them was Roe v. Wade, which is abortion related. That is the right to have an abortion. So there was a case in the Texas courts, and that set precedent. That means that every other state, everywhere, would now have the right to have an abortion. It would be legal. But then usually people appeal. So it goes to the next court. That court can issue a stay, which means that the decision, that is the right that people have to have an abortion, might be delayed. That is, they can say, this is not going to hold until we make a decision. And that's what a stay is. And then it moves up all the way to the Supreme Court. And then once the Supreme Court makes a decision, then even though in this case Roe was the woman, Wade was the people that were basically suing her to make sure that she couldn't have an abortion. Once the Supreme Court decided in favor of Roe that she could have an abortion, then that became legal, which meant that any woman in the United States could have an abortion. So that's what it means by precedent. It means that you don't need to have another case. It's every other case. You don't have to have other cases similar or related to it. And so then because it sets precedent, so you asked that are there special precedents? Well, in theory, every precedent becomes codified law. That is, until the court or any court decides something different, it is the law. So if the Supreme Court says that, they decide a case, then that's law. Now that's law. And it's going to be law forever until the court decides something else. So in the case of Roe v. Wade, what happened was there was another case brought, the Dobbs case, which another state brought a different lawsuit. And normally the Supreme Court, because it already decided in 1972 about Roe v. Wade, they would not take up that case. But because of politics, and we could talk about that if you'd like, what happened is that the court was very different. The members of the court were very different. And so they decided to take up that case, and they changed their mind. They said that Roe v. Wade had been decided mistakenly, that there were faulty decision-making on Roe v. Wade, and therefore Dobbs now took the right away from women. And now what the court said was that states could allow or could restrict abortion in different places. So as a result, several states in the United States do not allow people to have abortions. Mississippi's one, Texas, Kansas, etc. Yeah. Yeah,
perception
I
that
mean, legally too. It's quite unusual for a court to change its mind.
sure, sure. And in this case, that it was like a very advanced court, like, and
Mhm.
and now having this, I think that everyone in the world was like looking, like waiting to know what they were going to answer, like to resolve, uh, to know what would happen maybe in the future and about
Mhm.
these very important rights.
Mhm.
Um, I consider that that specifically is not a good resolution. Of course, in my perception, that's a step back from the moment that we need now, where we are now, and what we need in the future.
Mhm.
I was thinking about like not only that very specific and very important case, but also about other cases. So talking about
Mhm.
cases, which which one or which ones do you think that are the most important cases that the Supreme Court of the United States have solved?
Well, I mean, there's too many to list, but the ones that I think were central, at least especially related to rights, Brown v. Board of Topeka, which desegregated schools, is one. Um, Loving v. Virginia, which made it illegal to ban interracial marriages, is another one. Um, and then I can't remember all of the names, but there's many more related to, for instance, Dean or Heller is the last one, which allowed gay marriage to be legal, um, and so on. But in that case, so actually, gay marriage is another example. Is another good example. Is similar to Roe v. Wade. What happened was that people basically sued. So there was a like a couple, a gay couple that sued to have the right to marry, and this went up the courts, appellate courts, and then it ended up in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that 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 it should be legal, that people should have a right to marry people of the same sex, and so that became law in the United States. So places like Mississippi, for instance, or Idaho or Wyoming would never, ever uh, allow this because they're so conservative. They would never pass a law that says people can get married or people of the same sex could get married. But now, because the Supreme Court said that they could, then that became the norm. That became the law.
Have here in Mexico. Do you think that the United States should have one, or do you think that the present system work?
I'm not sure I know what progressivity means in Mexico. What does that mean?
That we have our like our citizens like for being citizens to as once as we earn a right, the judges or the people that that take care of that can't take them down. Like we have them, and we only can go one.
Oh, I see. So that once the court decides there's a right, they can't change it. They can't change their minds.
Exactly.
But also that they need to approach like step by step to the like main goal, like to give like real effect to those rights.
Right. Okay. So, well, I mean, okay. So the issue with this is the advantage of having a common law system, which is that it sets precedent, is that it can change its mind and it can be very quick. So things, could be going for quite a while, and politicians might not want to do things. Like in the case of Roe v. Wade, politicians didn't want to allow abortion. They also didn't want to allow desegregation of schools, etc. And courts can then come in and basically advocate for people. So that's the advantage. However, the disadvantage is that if you get a court members that then don't want to do that, then they can change their mind. So it's a double-edged sword because on the one hand, you can gain rights very quickly that otherwise would never happen. There would never be a political, like a political effort, or would be very difficult to get through Congress or through state systems. So that's the advantage. But then disadvantage is it can also go away. So would I like the progressivity, what you asked? I mean, sure, that sounds great. I would like that as a general principle, but that would not be possible in the in common law, because what that would mean is that you basically would force courts to never look at cases again. Like, it would be settled and they could not re-question themselves. And so on the one hand, I mean, that sounds good if you agree with the outcome, right? At the court, the decision. But if you don't, for instance, another very, very, very famous case was Plessy v. Ferguson in 1898, I believe. And in that case, the court decided that Black people were not citizens. And that because, of course, there were discrimination against Black people because of slavery after 1860s. And so in that case, the rights, the person that got the rights were basically white people in this case. And so if there was progressivity, like you just said, in that case, that court case would not have been able to be changed, right? Because the person that got the rights, in this case, was the person that owned the property. They had those rights and you couldn't change them. At least as I understand what you're saying about progressivity. So, I mean, it has advantages and disadvantages. And these things are political, of course. The way that people perceive them, the way that people react to them, the way that social movements are based around courts. So, for instance, one of the things that was very important is because the courts worked like this in the US, the civil rights movement of the 1960s, a huge part of their strategy was to use the courts to gain rights. You would sue and be very strategic about the things that you did to get the Supreme Court to react. And the same way, the other way. So the civil rights movement used that, but then also the conservative movement. They also used the court to do the other way, to get what they say is rights for themselves. So, like, for instance, the Supreme Court has decided that religious schools have the right to discriminate. Things like, well, what I mean by that is that religion. So the case that they just decided recently, about a year ago, in Maine, which is one of the states in the northern part of the U.S., had a law that said that if you were a private school and you discriminated against people on the base of religion, on your religious beliefs, you would not be able to get state funding. So in this case, what the religious school was discriminated against was LGBT people. So gay people couldn't, like, there were certain things that the school didn't allow in that school because, like, the religious beliefs were that gay people, this is a sin, and that that lifestyle was sinful, and so they didn't approve of it. So the state of Maine said, okay, you can exist, you can have this religious school, but no public funding can go to you because you're discriminating against gay people. So the Supreme Court then said, actually, that's discrimination against religious people, and therefore you must give them public funding just like you would to any other school. And that happened because conservatives in the US used the Supreme Court strategically. They sued so that they could get this result.
Related with migration, I was wanting to ask you about what are the latest decisions about the U.S. Supreme Court about this topic?
Oh, there's so many of them. The problem is so it's very complicated because the judges are part of the executive branch. So immigration courts don't usually set precedent because they're part of the executive branch. So I can't even tell you specific cases because they don't set precedent. So people don't usually know about them, right? So there are particular cases, like asylum cases, for instance, about with specific individuals. They're inter partes as opposed to setting precedent. Inter partes. But what they've done in terms of larger situations, for instance, is that there has been a lot of cases related to the Border Patrol. So one famous example from the 70s was California versus the U.S. Border Patrol, was that the U.S. Border Patrol, could the U.S. Border Patrol use your complexion? So if I thought you were Mexican, and that was my only information about you, if I saw you like running and I had no other information other than you were running and you looked Mexican, could I stop you? Right? Because I'm the Border Patrol. And so I don't know that you're here legally. I just see that you look Mexican. Could I use that information as the right to stop you? The Supreme Court said yes. Yes, you can. You can use basically racial profiling within certain parameters. So, for instance, I couldn't just stop you away from the border. I had to have more reason. So, like if we're close to the border, if you're running, et cetera, then I could. So that's one. The other examples were related to jails, and basically how long can people stay when you come across the U.S. border and you get detained. How long can you be detained? And so there has been many cases about the power that the U.S. has to hold people. One famous case, Flores case, during the Clinton administration, they basically ruled that children could not be detained for longer than a certain amount of time. And I don't remember exactly how long. I think it was 3 weeks. That they couldn't do that. Other cases are about the right that you have to appeal your case if you are a U.S. citizen, or if you are wrongfully detained through immigration. And basically they said you did have a right, but the one that they said that you didn't was if you were detained and you were gonna be deported to another country, you did not have the right to be left free if that country did not want you. So for instance, if a Mexican person gets detained in the US and then you get deported for violating immigration law, Mexico has to say, yes, you can be brought back, right? Whenever they hand you to the officers. And so if Mexico says no, then according to the Supreme Court, you don't have the right to be let free. You have to basically stay detained. So that has created a huge problem, because Mexico is not really the problem, but for instance, if you're North Korean, if you're Venezuelan, if you're Vietnamese, and other places that are not Iran, if you're not, they're not friendly with the United States, they usually don't allow people to get deported back. Cuba is another one. So then you are just basically there. You're basically, you can be held on or detained indefinitely, which is a huge problem. And so, yeah, and that sets precedent, which means that, that's the law.
Something else, well, much more, but
Sure.
first, about judges. Do you think that judges interpret freely, like in the United States, or do you think that the interpretation that we have in Mexico, it's more open than the one that you have there?
So you're asking if if judges here interfere more? Are they more political?
Interpret.
Interpret. Okay, so because courts in the U.S. have so much more power, than Mexican judges do normally under normal circumstances. They tend to be more political in general, I think. Even if they themselves don't think they are, they are. Like, even if you wanted to be quote unquote neutral, because you have power to set precedent, you're more political, right? Any decision you make is going to have more political outcomes. Because that's the case, there has been a long established effort on the part, especially of conservatives, to staff courts around the country with very conservative people. So there's something called the Heritage Foundation, whose entire purpose, like the reason they exist, is to put people, conservative judges, on the bench in courts. That's why they exist. So they basically, whenever Trump came into office, in the US, the way that judges get to be part of the judiciary is that the president has to nominate them and the Senate has to approve them. So when Trump became president, the Heritage Foundation basically had a list. Here are all these people. You know, these are good conservative judges. You should nominate these people. That's what they do. And so because of that, then there has now been an effort on the other side, the liberals, who want to do the same thing. Now, the liberals are not as powerful as the conservative efforts are, but they are more they're doing this more. So I would say that judges in the US are not as neutral as you might think. Even if they think of themselves as neutral, they are not. And so often whenever people are talking about a case in the United States, people often talk about who was the president that appointed them. So they will say, you know, like, this court decided such and such. 3 Bush appointees joined the Clinton appointees and a Trump appointee in deciding X or Y. Because this sort of signals to people that, you know, if they're conservative or not, or more liberal or not. It used to be, up until the 1980s, that judges were more neutral, that there was no effort to make sure that they were conservative or liberal. But since the 1980s, this has changed, and they are very political now. Nominations are very political. So whenever there's a Supreme Court justice opening, it's a huge deal, and people talk about it, you know, for months and months and months. And who's it going to be? And, you know, are they going to be this or that? Especially on the conservative side.
But talking about that, I want to ask you something about a checks and balances system that you have there, and how does they operate in the judiciary power in the United States?
So you mean what? So how can Congress react to if they don't like what the Supreme Court did, or
like first, which are your checks and balances?
Okay, so the basic checks and balances. So the Supreme Court justices are lifetime appointments. So they are for life until they die. They cannot be removed unless they are impeached. So Congress has to impeach them and remove them. And in theory, the only way to impeach a judge is for that person to have committed a crime or some kind of corruption or something like this. In the entire history of the United States, that has only happened once. There has only been one justice that was removed, and that was in the 19th century. In the 20th century, that has never happened. There have been judges that have given up their justice position, like they have retired. That's more common. Sometimes because of political sort of reasons, but that is, it's not necessarily the norm. And the norm is for people to die in office. So that's the first thing. And so Congress, in theory, could remove them, but in practice, basically has never done it once. They've done it once. And the reason why is that proving that justices are corrupt is very hard. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that they have to have a supermajority in Congress to remove them, which usually means that you have to have a party, supermajorities of a single party, and that's very unlikely. So that's the other reason. On that side of the courts. Now, in terms of what the Supreme Court can do vis-a-vis everyone else, the Supreme Court can declare things unconstitutional, and often does. Congress will pass a law, and the Supreme Court can gut it, can say, no, that's not right, or that law cannot proceed. So that's the check. Now, one thing that is very, very important, I want people to know about this, that's coming up. They're deciding it right now. It's a case, Chevron versus the United States. And this case is about the administrative power that the bureaucracy has in the U.S. So normally, the way it goes is like this. There's a law, and then it says, like, for instance, if we're going to regulate watershed, for instance, or like, I don't know, bank regulations or something from the political system that we're administering. Normally, Congress says, and we give the bureaucracy like NASA or the Environmental Protection Agency or whatever the administration is in charge of looking at this to make their, if we haven't covered it, for them to be able to do it, like to use their own understanding to, like, for instance, if they say, we want to protect this river, that's the law that says that the Colorado River has to be better administered. And we didn't say something specific about this pollutant. We didn't mention it in the law. The EPA can say, well, Congress said we should regulate, and this pollutant is contaminating the river. So we say that they need to do something about that pollutant, like whoever's putting the pollutant in the river. Okay, so that's normally how it works. The law the case that is being heard in the Supreme Court right now is that businesses are challenging the power of the bureaucracy to do that. They say Congress cannot give up that power. They have to be explicit in what they are regulating. And if they don't say explicitly what the law says, like in this case, they would have to say the pollutant or, whatever, to actually explicitly say that, then Congress is giving up too much power. And so the EPA cannot do this on their own. So people are worried that the Supreme Court will say that is right, that the EPA cannot do this on their own, and that they will not be able to regulate it. Because if that happens, the administrative state is basically dead. It would mean that the EPA could not take decisions on its own for the benefit of the public. They would have to wait for Congress to pass something. And that would really complicate things. It would make it much worse for everyone.
Thanks. And on the other hand, I would like to ask you, in your opinion, what's the role that the judiciary power plays in the elections for president in the United States?
That's a great question.
Sure.
Especially because today, actually, you probably saw that the Supreme Court said that Trump could run. So normally the Supreme Court doesn't. They have decided in several occasions how to regulate elections. So the way it works in the U.S., which is very different than in Mexico. In Mexico, elections are national, and the INE, which is a national body, regulates elections. In the U.S., there is no INE, nothing even close to the INE, nothing like that. Instead, every state has its own electoral rules, And not only every state, but every county within that state. So for instance, I live in Boston, and in my case, my county, Suffolk County, is the one that runs the elections. So the ballot is one way. And if I go to another county, the ballot would be different. They would have different people, and it would look different, and it would be regulated differently. And then if I go to New Hampshire, the way, like how you can vote, the way that people count the election, the ballots, all of that is different. So normally, the way that the judiciary has regulated this is state courts are the ones that normally regulate. So they'll say, Massachusetts has to allow this question on the ballot or not, or this candidate did not meet the requirements to be on the ballot, things like that. But on occasion, the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court has decided on elections based on race. So one big issue that has happened because of the 1960s and because of the discrimination that used to happen against African Americans, a big thing that happened was that the South in particular would make these districts where Black people would not be represented. They would create districts where they would basically break up populations, so those populations would be in bigger districts that were majority white. And in that case, they would have no representation. So in the 1960s, there were laws that passed that said that you had to have majority minority districts, that is, districts that represented Black people. So the Supreme Court has, on occasion, based on things like that to allow or to not allow districts to be created if they're not majority or minority, right? So that's one thing that they have done. Now, in this case today, what they decided today was that because every state can decide who's on the ballot, like I said, Colorado and Maine and Illinois had said that Trump could not be on the ballot because he had been an insurrectionist. What happened on January 6th had been a call for an insurrection. And in the Constitution, it says that people that are insurrectionists cannot run for office. So Colorado and Maine and Illinois said, yeah, that's right. That means Trump cannot run for office. So the Supreme Court today said, no, he can run, but not because he's not an insurrectionist, because individual states cannot decide on their own to take out a federal candidate. So they might be able to decide on state candidates, but not federal. So like Colorado cannot decide for California, cannot decide for Florida. And therefore, you cannot take Trump from the ballot. That's what they decided today. How that goes forward is unclear. What that means for future candidates or what it means for people that were part of the January 6th insurrection. It's unclear if that means that they can run for office or not, but presumably they can.
Well, great. That was a great decision from the U.S. court. Yeah, sure. But well, like, and finally, I want to ask your opinion about your considerations regarding the actual problems in the U.S. Supreme Court. Which do you think could be like one or like some of the most important problems?
Well, there's two big problems. The first is I think that they last too long. I like the Mexican system much better, which is that they are, I believe, 15 years that they can be in the court, right? 15 years?
Well, it depends, like judges, like what jurisdiction, but do you mean like
Supreme Court?
Justice? Yeah.
15 years in the Supreme Court, right?
Right.
Right. So here is lifetime. So I don't like that at all. I think that's detrimental to the U.S. It's too political because if it was 15 years, people would not, the politics around choosing the judges would not be what they are. I think people are obsessed because, for instance, it used to be that you would get a judge that was older, somebody that was experienced, somebody in their 60s. because you wanted them to interpret the law after having been in the court for a long time. But because now it's so political, they want younger and younger people, because it means that if you get somebody in their 40s, that person could be in the court for 40 years, 50 years. And that's what you want, right? If you're the president, or if you're in the conservative or liberal even, you want younger and younger people. So that's the first problem, that it takes a lifetime situation. The other problem is that because the U.S., most of the way that the political system in the U.S. Works is that it's created, it wasn't explicitly written down. The Constitution was written in 1787, and a lot of what the courts do are not explicitly, there was no law that created it, but instead it became over time from just practice. So, like, for instance, the right of a constitutional review comes from Marshall, comes actually from a case, Marbury versus Madison, in 1804, which is not something that was legally, the Congress didn't pass a law or anything like that. It's not in the Constitution. So because of that, the Supreme Court in the U.S. does not have a lot of rules that apply to everyone else, every other judge, but not them. So ethics, for instance, one of the big things, this is a huge problem. You can give money to a judge, to a Supreme Court judge, and it's perfectly legal. There is nothing against, like, for instance, I could buy a house, I could buy judges' houses, and it's not illegal to do that. And in theory, they're supposed to recuse themselves from cases, but if they don't, there's no law that says they have to. There's no requirement. There's a voluntary ethical rule, but it's voluntary. They can decide on themselves. So that's another problem. And what's happened is, in the past 20 years, judges, most famously Clarence Thomas, have been taking a lot of money from rich people and basically ruling in their favor. And it's perfectly legal. There is nothing against, anything against Thomas that they can do, unless Congress impeach them and remove them. But there's no majorities for that to be able to happen. So those are big, big problems.
¿Algo para finalizar?
No, muchas gracias. Siempre es muy divertido, muy interesante, porque cuando en realidad mi vida me la paso comparando sistemas, todo el tiempo, todos los días. Y cuando estamos hablando del sistema judicial en Estados Unidos, pues tiene sus ventajas y desventajas, pero yo quisiera que pudiéramos tomar lo mejor y quitar lo peor, y al revés en México también, ¿no?
Sin duda. Sin duda, pero bueno, hay diferencias importantes y para todos los compañeros, para todas las compañeras, para todos los colegas que les interesa en algún momento conocer un poco más el sistema americano, pues me gustaría que nos pudieras dar alguna referencia ya para terminar acerca de quién te quiera seguir, quien quiera conocer un poco más acerca de tu trabajo, dónde te puede encontrar, qué tendría que consultar, no sé si pudieras ahí darnos una guía.
Bueno, pues, ¿quieren que deje mi correo
Sí, si
o sea,
quieres darnos tu correo o
bueno, mi correo es luis.jimenez@umb.edu. Ahí, sin problema, me pueden mandar lo que quieran, me pueden, escribir si quieren, en realidad yo lo que hago es política comparada, entonces es más en general la política, ¿no? Um, en términos de libros, mandé una lista de libros que si quieres puedes, mencionar ahí, pero son en inglés, no sé si en
sí,
español no
Para,
conozco.
para todos los que quieran conocer un poco más, también pueden escribirnos al Seminario de Filosofía del Derecho y podemos compartirles la lista de libros que Luis nos ha recomendado para conocer un poco más de los temas que él trabaja y también acerca de este tema del funcionamiento del sistema judicial americano. Con todo gusto se los podemos compartir. No tengo aquí la lista a la mano, no sé si tú la tienes, Victoria.
Me parece que no, pero si nos escriben, con mucho gusto se las podemos pasar.
Ok.
Sí, es que eran como cuatro y no me acuerdo de momento, los que mandé, pero, pues sí son, hay uno que es muy famoso, que se llama The American Legal System, y es como el más básico. Um, es como los que le dan a las personas que están en derecho como el primer semestre.
Ujú.
Ese es como el más básico. Pero hay muchos, que son, nada más cómo funciona. Hay otros que en la política, que es lo que yo más hago, que son un poco más distintos, que tiene que ver más bien como por qué los jueces, los escogen como los escogen, por qué la Suprema Corte ha decidido ciertas formas y no de una forma y no de otra, y así.
Perfecto. Muchísimas gracias, Luis, de nuevo. Ha sido un gran placer escucharte y también, bueno, pues que hayas podido darnos estas explicaciones. Me despido de ustedes, no sin antes, por supuesto, agradecer a quien ha estado conmigo en la mesa, Victoria, que ha hecho un gran trabajo, al igual que quienes se encuentran en la cabina apoyándonos. Muchísimas gracias, Eduardo. Y bueno, pues nos vemos en nuestra siguiente edición de Lcda todos los lunes a las 5 de la tarde del Seminario de Filosofía del Derecho. Muchísimas gracias. Un abrazo y hasta pronto.
La Facultad de Derecho agradece a quienes realizaron este programa, conductores, invitados y productores, quienes participan de manera honoraria. En News, Canal Multimedia, Derecho a tus oídos.